Random House Audio presents The Devil's Star by Joan Nesbo, translated from the Norwegian by Don Bartlett, read for you by Robin Sachs. Part 1. Chapter 1. Friday. Egg. The house was built in 1898 on a clay base that had since sunk a tiny bit on the west-facing side, causing water to cross the wooden threshold where the door was hung. It ran across the bedroom floor and left a wet streak over the oak parquet, moving west. The flow rested for a second in a dip before more water nudged it from behind, and it scurried like a nervous rat towards the skirting board. There the water went in both directions. It searched and somehow sneaked under the skirting until it found a gap between the end of the wooden flooring and the wall. In the gap lay a 5-krone coin bearing a profile of King Olaf's head and the date, 1987, the year before it had fallen out of the carpenter's pocket. But these were the boom years. A great many attic flats had needed to be built at the drop of a hat, and the carpenter had not bothered to look for it. It did not take the water much time to find a way through the floor under the parquet. Apart from when there was a leak in 1968, the same year a new roof was built on the house, the wooden floorboards had lain there undisturbed, drying and contracting so that the crack between the two innermost pine floorboards was now almost half a centimetre. The water dripped onto the beam beneath the crack and continued westwards and into the exterior wall. There it seeped into the plaster and the mortar that had been mixed 100 years before, also in midsummer, by Jacob Andersen, a master bricklayer and father of 5. Andersen, like all bricklayers in Oslo at that time, mixed his own mortar and wall plaster. Not only did he have his own unique blend of lime, sand, and water, he also had his own special ingredients: horsehair and pig's blood. Jacob Andersen was of the opinion that the hair and the blood held the plaster together and gave it extra strength. It was not his idea, he told his head-shaking colleagues at the time. His Scottish father and grandfather had used the same ingredients from sheep. Even though he had renounced his Scottish surname and taken on a trade name, he saw no reason to turn his back on 600 years of heritage. Some of the bricklayers considered it immoral. Some thought he was in league with the devil, but most just laughed at him. Perhaps it was one of the latter who spread the story that was to take hold in the burgeoning town of Christiania. A coachman from Grünerløkka had married his cousin from Värmland, and together they moved into a one-room flat plus kitchen in one of the apartment blocks in Seilduksgata that Andersen had helped to build. The couple's first child was unlucky enough to be born with dark, curly hair and brown eyes, and since the couple were blonde, with blue eyes, and the man was jealous by nature as well, late one night he tied his wife's hands behind her, took her down to the cellar, and bricked her in. Her screams were effectively muffled by the thick walls where she stood bound and squeezed between the two brick surfaces. The husband had perhaps thought that she would suffocate from lack of oxygen, but bricklayers do allow for ventilation. In the end, the poor woman attacked the wall with her bare teeth. And that might well have worked, because as the Scottish bricklayer used blood and hair, thinking that he could save on the expensive lime in the cement mix, the result was a porous wall that crumbled under the attack from strong Värmland teeth. However, her hunger for life sadly led to her taking excessively large mouthfuls of mortar and brick. Ultimately, she was unable to chew, swallow, or spit, and the sand, pebbles, and chunks of clay blocked her windpipe. Her face turned blue, her heartbeat slowed, and then she stopped breathing. She was what most people would call dead. According to the myth, however, the taste of pig's blood had the effect of making the unfortunate woman believe she was still alive, and with that she immediately broke free of the ropes that bound her, passed through the wall, and began to walk again. A few old people from Grünerløkka still remember the story from their childhood about the woman with the pig's head walking around with a knife to cut off the heads of small children who were out late. She had to have the taste of blood in her mouth so that she didn't vanish into thin air. At the time, very few people knew the name of the bricklayer, and Andersen worked tirelessly at making his special blend of mortar. 3 years later, while working on the building where the water was now leaking, he fell from the scaffolding, leaving only 200 kroner and a guitar. And so it was to be another 100 years before bricklayers began to use artificial hair-like fibres in their cement mixes, and before technicians at a laboratory in Milan discovered that the walls of Jericho had been strengthened with blood and camel hair. Most of the water, however, did not run into the wall, but down it, because water, like cowardice and lust, always finds the lowest level. At first, the water was absorbed by the lumpy, granular insulation between the joists, but more followed, and soon the insulation was saturated. The water went right through it and soaked up a newspaper dated July 11th, 1898, in which it said the building industry's boom time had probably reached its peak, and the unscrupulous property speculators were sure to have harder times ahead. On page 3 it said that the police still had no leads regarding the murder of a young nurse who had been found dead from stab wounds in a bathroom the previous week. In May, a girl mutilated and killed in a similar way was found near the river Akerselva, but the police would not say whether the two cases could be connected. The water ran off the newspaper, between the wooden boards underneath, and along the inside of the painted ceiling fabric of the room below. Since this had been damaged during the repair of the leak in 1968, the water seeped through the holes, forming drops that hung on until they became heavy enough for gravity to defy the surface tension. They let go and fell 3 meters and 8 centimeters. There the water landed and terminated its trajectory into water. Vibeke Knudsen sucked hard on her cigarette and blew smoke out of the open window on the 4th floor of the apartment building. It was a warm afternoon, and the air rose from the sun-baked asphalt in the backyard, taking the smoke up the light blue house front until it dispersed. On the other side of the roof you could hear the sound of a car in the usually busy Ullevålsveien, but now everyone was on holiday, and the town was almost deserted. A fly lay on its back on the windowsill with its 6 feet in the air. It hadn't had the sense to get out of the heat. It was cooler at the other end of the flat, facing Ullevålsveien, but Vibeke didn't like the view from there. Our Saviour's Cemetery, crowded with famous people, famous dead people. On the ground floor there was a shop selling monuments, as the sign said, in other words, headstones. What one might call staying close to the market. Vibeke rested her forehead against the cool glass of the window. She had been happy when the warm weather came, but her happiness had soon worn off. Even now she was longing for cooler nights and people in the streets. Today there had been 5 customers in the gallery before lunch, and 3 after. She had smoked 1.5 packets of cigarettes out of sheer boredom. Her heart was pounding and she had a sore throat. In fact, she could hardly speak when the boss rang and asked how things were going. All the same, no sooner had she arrived home and put the potatoes on than she felt the craving in the pit of her stomach again. Vibeke had stopped smoking when she met Anders 2 years before. He hadn't asked her to, quite the contrary. When they met on Gran Canaria, he had even bummed a cigarette off her, just for a laugh. When they moved in together, just 1 month after getting back to Oslo, one of the first things he had said was that their relationship would probably be able to stand a little passive smoking, and that cancer researchers were undoubtedly exaggerating. With a little time, he would probably get used to the smell of cigarettes on their clothes. The next morning she made up her mind. When, some days later, he mentioned over lunch that it was a long time since he had seen her with a cigarette in her hand, She answered that she had never really been much of a smoker.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?